Thank you all for joining us tonight for this special event with Elizabeth Kolbert, whose remarks will be setting the stage for a conversation she'll be having with the artist in PEM's Down to the Bone exhibition, Edward Koren and Stephen Gorman. We'll close out the evening with a Q&A with all of you, so please feel free to share your questions and comments using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. I'm Jane Winchell, the Sarah Fraser Robbins Director of the Dottie Brown Art and Nature Center and Curator of Natural History. I've also been leading PEM's Climate and Environment Initiative and co-curated Down to the Bone with Trevor Smith, PEM's Associate Director of Multisensory Experience and Curator of the Present Tense. Tonight's program is in honor of the upcoming closing of Down to the Bone on February 5th. I am particularly delighted that Elizabeth could be with us this evening, since her work, her book, The Sixth Extinction, was a primary influence on Ed Koren's artwork in the exhibition. And one of her quotes also appears on the wall of the show. Elizabeth Kolbert is a Pulitzer Prize-winning writer and a guiding light in scientific journalism, who has been sounding the alarm nationally about climate change and other serious environmental threats for decades. As both a beloved staff writer for The New Yorker and a masterful author, her most recent book is Under a White Sky, The Nature of the Future. Thank you so much for joining us, Elizabeth. We are honored to have you, and it is a privilege to welcome you on behalf of PEM.
Well, thanks very much for having me. It's a real honor to be speaking with you, Jane, tonight, and everyone out there in the audience in connection with Ed and Steve's exhibit, Down to the Bone. And the reason that I'm here tonight, as Jane mentioned, is that I'm the author of The Sixth Extinction, which Ed has cited as one of the inspirations for the series of lithographs that are part of the show. And Ed and I did an event together several years ago when some of the lithographs were shown in Bennington, Vermont at the Bennington Museum. And that was a great pleasure to meet Ed. And Ed and Steve's work obviously speak to each other in very interesting ways, which I'm sure that they will discuss later on this evening. And I'm just going to start by sort of setting the stage by talking about the subject that links the three of us, which is the current extinction event, or if you prefer, current mass extinction event, or if you like, the sixth extinction. So what is an extinction event? To answer this question, I'm actually going to read a bit from my book. The same way that acoustical engineers speak of background noise, biologists talk about background extinction. In ordinary times here understood to mean whole geological epochs, extinction takes place only very rarely, more rarely even than speciation, and it occurs at what's known as the background extinction rate. This rate varies from one group of organisms to another. It's often expressed in terms of extinctions per million species years. Calculating the background extinction rate is a laborious task that entails combing through whole databases worth of fossils. For what's probably the best studied group, which is mammals, it's been reckoned to be roughly 0.25 per million species years. That means since there are about 5,500 mammal species wandering around the world today, at the background extinction rate, you'd expect, once again, very roughly, one species to disappear every 700 years. Mass extinctions are different. Instead of a background hum, there's a crash, and disappearance rates spike. Anthony Hallam and Paul Wignell, British paleontologists who have written extensively on the subject, define mass extinctions as events that eliminate a significant proportion of the world's biota in a geologically insignificant amount of time. Another expert, David Jablonski, characterizes mass extinctions as substantial biodiversity losses that occur rapidly and are global in extent. Michael Benton, a paleontologist who has studied the end Permian extinction, uses the metaphor of the tree of life. During a mass extinction, vast swaths of the tree are cut short, as if attacked by crazed, axe-wielding madmen. A fifth paleontologist, David Raup, has tried looking at matters from the perspective of the victims. Species are at low risk of extinction most of the time, but this condition of relative safety is punctuated at rare intervals by a vastly higher risk. The history of life thus consists of, quote, long periods of boredom interrupted occasionally by panic. In times of panic, whole groups of once dominant organisms can disappear or be relegated to secondary roles, almost as if the globe has undergone a caste change. Such wholesale losses have led paleontologists to surmise that during mass extinction events, the usual rules of survival are suspended. Conditions change so drastically or so suddenly, or so drastically and so suddenly, that evolutionary history counts for very little. Indeed, the traits that have been most useful for dealing with ordinary threats may turn out, under such extraordinary circumstances, to be fatal. Today, amphibians enjoy the dubious distinction of being the world's most endangered class of animals. It's been calculated that the group's extinction rate could be as much as 45,000 times higher than the background rate. But extinction rates among many other groups are approaching amphibian levels. It is estimated that 1/3 of all reef-building corals, 1/3 of all freshwater mollusks, 1/3 of sharks and rays, 1/4 of all mammals, 1/5 of all reptiles, and 1/6 of all birds are headed toward oblivion. The losses are occurring all over in the South Pacific and in the North Atlantic, in the Arctic, and in the Sahel, in lakes and on islands, on mountaintops, and in valleys. If you know how to look, you can probably find signs of the current extinction event in your own backyard. So as I mentioned in that passage that I just read, it should take something like 7 centuries for one mammal species to go extinct. So that means that in the course of a human lifetime, to the closest approximation, no mammal should go extinct. And that means anywhere, in the world. But I can name for you, and you can probably name for yourselves, several mammalian species that have gone extinct just in the last few decades. They include the Yangtze river dolphin, which was last seen in 2002, the bramble K. melomus, which was a rat-like creature from Australia, which was last seen in 2009, and the Christmas Island pipistrelle, which is a bat, which also went extinct around 2009. And if we add in creatures that are functionally extinct, which is to say they only survive in captivity or in very carefully monitored breeding programs, that list grows significantly. It includes the black-footed ferret, which once could be found all over the American West. It includes the red wolf, which is native to the southeastern US, and the northern hairy-nosed wombat, which was once common up and down eastern Australia, but is now down to about 300 individuals. And I could go through this exercise for pretty much every group out there that has been sufficiently studied. As I mentioned, amphibians are considered the most threatened class of animals today. They've been really devastated by a fungal pathogen that got spread around the world, known as quite sure how. And I spent about 4 years reporting the 6th extinction. And in that time, I spent a lot of time with frogs and herpetologists, and I saw one frog species that has since gone extinct and 3 others that are now extinct in the wild. I sought a career in herpetology because I enjoy working with animals, a frog expert named Joe Mendelson told me. I did not anticipate that it would come to resemble paleontology. So why should people care about this? Well, if you're here tonight, probably you do care. But you'd be surprised how often I get asked that question. In fact, I got asked it on NPR by Terry Gross once. And I think there are several ways to answer this question. And the first, and probably simplest, is self-interest. Whatever we might like to believe about people and their ingenuity, people are part of the biosphere, and we depend on the functioning of the biosphere. It's obviously the case that we, people, can persist without a lot of other species. There was a major wave of extinctions, the megafauna extinction, all the way back in prehistory, as humans started moving around the world and settled new parts of the world, first Australia, and then the Americas. And they killed off, I think there's pretty good agreement on this now, killed off a lot of very large animals in the process, mammoths, mastodons, and so on. And here we all are. We seem to have done fine without them, although probably there were a lot of co-extinctions. So organisms that went extinct when those animals went extinct, some of them may have simply been, lice that depended on them. The thing is that we don't know how many species or which species we can lose before the systems that we ourselves depend on collapse. So a few decades ago, the Stanford biologist Paul Ehrlich came up with what's become known as the rivet model of extinction. And basically what Ehrlich proposed is that ecosystems are like airplanes. There's a lot of redundancy built into them, and that's a good thing. A plane can pop one rivet and keep flying. It can pop another and still keep flying. If it pops enough rivets, though, it has to make an emergency landing. And if it pops more than that, it might just fall out of the sky. And unfortunately, in the case of the biosphere, you may not get any warning that you're about to fall out of the sky until it's too late to make that emergency landing. So erring on the side of prudence, erring on the side of caution, would seem to be prudent. Another reason we should care is obviously ethical. Don't all species possess certain rights, the most basic of which is the right to exist? Philip Carafora, a philosopher who has written on this issue, has said, "The goodness of the human career on Earth depends as much on how well we appreciate and get along with other species as on how well we do so with other people." I wrote a piece last year for the New Yorker about a legal movement that's seeking to grant rights to nature. I think it's a really important and fascinating movement. In 2008, Ecuador adopted a new constitution that became the world's first to enshrine rights for nature. The constitution's preamble celebrates Pachamama, which translates from Quechua as Mother Earth. And a later section of the Constitution enumerates the rights that Mother Earth enjoys. And these include the right to integral respect for its existence and the right to be restored. And in 2021, in a key decision, Ecuador's highest court ruled that mining permits that had been granted in an area, sort of protected forest north of Quito called Los Cedros, violated these constitutional provisions and therefore had to be voided. And those permits are held by Ecuador's national mining company. The case was a big deal, and it's still playing out today in 2023. And the last reason that I'll mention, which is I think particularly relevant for tonight's discussion, has to do with empathy. As the biologist Colin Tudge has written, it is a huge privilege to live on Earth and to share it with so many goodly and fantastical creatures. And this is what I think Ed's lithographs and Steve's photographs really bring home. And this is something that the three of us discussed the other day when we were talking about tonight's program. We humans share millions of years of evolutionary history with literally every species on Earth. Certainly our ancestors felt great kinship with the natural world, and many indigenous peoples today still feel that kinship. In the industrialized world in 2023, I don't think most people do feel that. Is there any way to work our way back? Can art lead the way? I am going to throw that out there to Ed and Steve and to all of you in the audience. And I will end there and hand things back to Jane.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. You have packed a lot in a short amount of time, and I love the way you've honed the message regarding extinction and the relatedness of that to the work that Ed and Steve have contributed to Down to the Bone. And before we switch to the conversation, I want to take a moment to welcome and briefly introduce the two wonderful artists who are the reason the Down to the Bone extinction came to be at Penn. Edward Koren is a graphic artist and satirist whose unmistakable art and cartoons have been part of the fabric of the New Yorker for the past 60 years. His images of bewildered skeletal creatures in Down to the Bone came to him from his imagination, while Stephen Gorman is an award-winning landscape and wildlife photographer who has been documenting the Arctic region over the past 2 decades. His haunting photos of polar bears in Kaktovik, Alaska, capture the threat facing these animals as sea ice forms later each year. Thanks so much for being here, both of you. I think people are often surprised to hear that the two of you created the artworks featured in the exhibition separately, and then discovered rather serendipitously that you were both speaking about the same issues. By pairing your works, it has raised your message of alarm to a new level of impact, which is reflected truly in the volume and thought-provoking nature of messages that visitors have left behind, visitors of all ages to your show. To me, this speaks to the importance of coming together, finding common ground across disciplines and artistic practices in order for people to see something from a different perspective and to feel moved, and maybe even to feel some empathy, like you were referring to, Elizabeth. And I wonder if this is a good place for us to start the conversation. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Delighted. I mean, I have to begin by throwing a huge kudos, lots of them, to Trevor and Janie and Peabody Essex for having the courage to put on this exhibition. And it has turned out to be, for me at least, one of the great experiences of my creative life and my artistic life. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Well, I feel the same way. It's been a real honor and a pleasure to work with Janie and Trevor, and with you, Ed, of course, and to get to know you, Elizabeth, as well. This has been a real opportunity. And I agree with you, Janie, when you said that it was, it all came about serendipitously. And we had no idea that we were working in the same space until I stumbled into a gallery in Rochester, Vermont, where Ed was having a show. And we saw his, I was with my wife, Mary, and we saw his lithographs on the wall. And she turned to me and said, "Look, Ed has drawn your photographs." And we looked at them, and the similarity was just jaw-dropping. The message that was contained in his work and the message that I put into my work were basically identical. And we got together and exchanged our works. And we were both very, taken with the similarity of the message, and decided we had to do something with it.
I think one of the interesting things to me and to a lot of people is that I am known as a satirist, as a cartoonist, as someone who kind of holds the mirror up to ourselves and sees ourselves and laughs. So it's a different role that I am playing. And thanks to Elizabeth's book, thanks to a lot of a trajectory that's too complex to explain it now, I ended up making lithographs in Paris on, it turns out, the very subject of extinction and of creatures morphing into very hapless, unhappy souls. And from that point on, this part of me I mean, I can characterize myself as John le Carré did, which is that my humor, I'm a student of human weakness. And the same, of course, could be said of Goya, Daumier, and other great satirists and comic artists. The other thing that I want to point out here is that as an artist, I am not an activist, nor am I in the weeds of sustaining the human race. I mean, not race, but the humanity, as so many of the thinkers that Elizabeth has brought up. But I do think that I'm mindful of what Mark Twain said, that humor, a source of humor, the secret source of humor, is sorrow. And sorrow is what I felt in reading your book, Elizabeth, and also just pursuing where my hand and brain didn't know where it was going with lithography and on stone, ancient stones, ancient ideas, ancient issues.
If I could jump in here for a second, I was just, Elizabeth, were you planning on responding there?
Well, I'm also very interested in, humor, and does humor reach people in a way that, there's so much bad news, and the way that, I do worry that people tune it out, and I am also, so I don't consider myself a humorist, but I do try to inject some humor into this subject for, better or worse. And so I was going to ask Ed about, sort of whether he feels that access is a different part of people's, gets around people's defense. I was also going to ask Steve how, that plays off of his own work, which I don't, I would not call humorous. How's that? But maybe there is some in there. I don't know. Anyway, I was just going to throw that out.
Well, I think Steve and I approach this from very, very different points of view. He's specific, and he is showing exactly what I am imagining, and the gaze, the soulfulness of living creatures is, I think, what ties us together, because the gaze of his imperiled bears are very similar to the sorrowful, kind of befuddled gaze of my own work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's a lot of parallels between the gaze from Ed's creatures, his befuddled creatures who are standing with the detritus of a collapsed civilization at their feet, wondering what happened. And they're looking out at the audience, and we share their confusion and their sense of loss and their sense of lack of direction. They don't know what's going on. And I think there's a parallel with some of the photographs that I took in Kaktovik of the bears who are scrambling over the bones of the remnant whales, trying to grab every little last bit of gristle and fat that they can possibly get from it to stave off starvation. But they're looking directly at the camera as well, and with the exact same gaze. And they're just also, it seems to me that they are asking the same question: what's going on? What's happening? Why is this the situation? And what can we do about this? So to get back to what Janie started with, the notion of empathy, I think that I felt a great deal of empathy for the bears. And I was not very far from them, just a matter of a few yards. And I was in their world, and they were looking at me and entering mine. And there was a great deal of communication there that I hope is conveyed in the art.
I think too that our connection together, Steve, is based on bones and the
Mhm.
the superfluity of bones. It is emblematic of just the entire situation we're talking about.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that that was the first thing that struck me when I saw your lithographs from Paris, was these creatures that are alive and dead at the same time, structured out of bone, and yet still mobile and still feeling and still expressive. And my bears were, and anyone who's seen the exhibit knows they are in a situation where there are just massive bone piles from bowhead whales that had been hunted. It's extraordinary scenes of massive piles of bones, 10, 15 feet high, with the bears clambering over them. And so you're right, the name for the show, Down to the Bone, really resonated because both of our works, featured the bones, but also it implies that we are at a moment and a real inflection point that is symbolized by the bones themselves in the artworks.
So the other thing that has crossed my mind is that what we're dealing with, and what you are in particular dealing with in the Kakavik, is interests, financial interests, notions of infinite growth and exploitation on one hand, and preservationists on the other, and how the community is reacting to that. And you described it to me once. Could you describe it again?
Well, Kaktovik is an Inupiat Eskimo village on a little island called Barter Island off the north coast of Alaska. And it lies entirely within the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which is the location or the scene of America's longest environmental battle. It's been going on since 1980 with opposing forces who want to either preserve the refuge in its entirety, or on the other side, interests who would like to drill for oil in this area. And this area where Kaktovik is specifically was left out of wilderness designation in 1980 when the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge was created for further study. We've been studying it now since 1980 and have come to no resolution over whether it's going to be preserved or it's going to be developed. It also happens to be the most concentrated breeding ground for polar bears in the United States. So whatever development might take place in that area would pose a tremendous difficulty, if not a great threat, to the polar bear population in Alaska, which is already in decline. So these bears are not only threatened with the potential development and disruption of their habitat, but as the planet has warmed, this area has warmed more than any other part of the planet. And the sea ice upon which the bears need to travel in order to hunt their staple prey, ringed seals, is forming later and later in the fall, and it's vanishing earlier and earlier in the summer. So they are spending more and more time on shore with basically nothing to eat. And so these bears gather in the vicinity of Kaktovik because the Inupiat have a traditional bowhead whale hunt wherein they catch 3 whales every fall for their own nutritional and spiritual purposes. And they then leave the remains of the whales after they've been stripped out at a spit at the end of the island, where up to 80 polar bears can gather to make use of the remnants of the whale hunt to tide them over until the sea ice forms and they can actually go out on the ice and hunt seals again. So this is basically a lifeline. It's a life raft for these bears at this point.
I have a practical question, Steve. The only time I've seen polar bears, it was always like someone had to be with you with a shot, rifle, because people do get eaten by polar bears. And I wondered if you Were you just out there by yourself, or how'd you do that?
No, I've been in the company of polar bears frequently all across the Arctic, in Alaska and Canada and Greenland. But in this particular situation, I was in a small boat with an Inupiat guide. It was basically, if you can envision, a little Boston whaler, about 17 feet long. And we were offshore, just offshore, where the bears were gathered on the sand spit, and on the there are little barrier islands. They're basically just a couple of feet above the sea, sand spits where these bears either wait with nothing to do except for waiting for the ice to form, or they swim across the lagoon over to Barter Island and go and make use of the remnant whale carcasses, and then swim back to where they spend the rest of the day. So you see them in the water often, swimming back and forth. But yeah, we're basically in the presence of bears, either in the water or on shore, but keeping a close eye out for their presence and not getting too close.
Could
So
I ask?
it's giving them enough space. Yeah.
Can I ask Elizabeth a question? Namely, I'm just curious about the overwhelming philosophy of our human society, which is that we have the right to exploit the resources and the lives of those we share the planet with, because this is an inalienable human right to grow and to consume and to just in general forge ahead, as we have always done, financially and tweaking policy in order to really achieve this.
Well, I mean, that's, I think the question of our time, really, and it's a very, immensely difficult one. I will determine the future of the world, clearly, of the planet. And I think that one of the, problems that we have is that all of us sitting here, have used way more of the planet's resources proportionately, just by virtue of being Americans, really, and leading a certain kind of lifestyle is very hard now. And we continue as Americans. I mean, we just have, if you just look at any measure of our consumption, greenhouse gas emissions per capita, just on and on, we're just way, way up there as consumers in the world. And now you have a lot of parts of the world where, the most sort of biodiverse parts of the world, which tend to be in the tropics for, reasons we can talk about, but trust me on that. We are now seeing in Brazil and in places like the Congo Basin, a lot of development pressure of the same kinds that we went through. The US was just completely deforested at a certain point. And it's very hard for us to turn around and say, you guys shouldn't be doing that and you guys shouldn't be consuming. That raises its own tremendous ethical questions. So we're in this kind of, in my view, impossible bind. And I don't know, I've never seen a really good solution to that, how, the UN has these things called sustainable development goals, and this is the idea that, everyone on the planet should have a certain standard of living, which I think, we would all agree with, but to do it sustainably. And the question of, can you actually do that? I believe, as I say, I think that is the question of the 21st century. And I don't have a good answer to that question.
Thank you.
I'd love to circle into each of you are storytellers in your own right, from my perspective, and be curious with this, the Elizabeth, what you bring up of like, it's not evident right now. what do you see each of you in the role of storytelling from your different places to allow people to imagine something, to open a possibility that might not otherwise be evident? Is that something that occurs to each of you in the work you're doing in this arena?
Go ahead. All right.
Yeah, I would have to say that yes. I mean, my whole purpose in going to Catastrophe to take the photographs of these bears was to point out this incredible conflict between our need for economic growth on the one hand and our need to preserve and protect our biosphere that sustains us on the other. We live in a system that is profoundly committed to growth and profoundly indifferent to nature and society. It has a growth mandate, the system that we live in, and it requires us to grow our economy every year by a minimum of 3%. And that means that we need to extract more and more from nature every year than we did the year before. And if we continue to grow at that rate, at current rates of economic growth, our economy is going to double in 15 years. That means we're going to double the amount of resources we extract. It means we're going to double the amount of pollution that we expel. It means we're going to double the amount of the biosphere that we take from other species. All the things that we've been talking about earlier in this conversation are profoundly affected by the system that we live in. And to get back to your question, Jeannie, I think one of the things we need to do is to imagine a different way of living, and perhaps imagine that it might be possible to decouple human life satisfaction from economic growth and consumption, and make way for other values and other experiences that give us our lives meaning and pleasure, that have nothing to do with consumption. And also imagine that we make space for other species to live their lives at the same time. So I think it's a question of changing the paradigm. And I think it's a question of creating new narratives that celebrate different ways of living and different measures of satisfaction.
What about you, Elizabeth, or you, Ed?
Well, I was thinking about a TED Talk I just was perusing recently about community awareness of stemming what we're all talking about, dealing with it. And it's an initiative in Florida to engage people in the community with both awareness and acts, like where there's a flood zone to post on their houses where in terms of the flood zone, the water will rise or above it, above the flood zone. And it dawned on me, these initiatives are hugely effective in getting people involved. But I kept wondering, doubting almost, that involvement and awareness is really what's needed here, except from what you're saying, Steve, and what you've been saying, Elizabeth, about this underlying lifestyle that is taken for granted and will not be surrendered. So what you see is these rather comfortable suburban houses, maybe even more than that, in Florida, that is barely above sea level rise during floods. And I kept wondering to myself, yes, this is a great idea, and people are really involved and engaged and thinking about this and aware, of course, of these issues. But where is that going to go?
Well, I think that one answer to that is pretty clear, that nature has her own plans for us. But you know, if something is not sustainable, then it cannot continue.
Hmm.
And that's just a law of nature. It's an irrefutable fact.
Well, I think one of the things that we've learned, you know, for better or worse over the last several decades is that things can be sustainable for humans, but profoundly unsustainable for everything else. And I think one of the big questions of, you know, not to be too heavy, but another, you know, central question of the next however long we're here is, you know, to what extent that pattern can continue. I think that is what profoundly worries people who look at, you know, Earth history, is that, you know, they see changes of a magnitude that you only see at moments of, you know, real crisis in the history of life right now. And that's, you know, climate change, but that's also changes in the nitrogen cycle, changes in the phosphorus cycle. You know, we can go on and on ways that people are really mucking around with basic, you know, biogeochemical systems. But one of the interesting things and why we still have this tension and why, you know, we're all here, I suppose, still having this conversation is that a lot of things, you know, as I alluded to at the beginning, it turns out to be true that humans are very adaptable and can, you know, we could perhaps live with you know, without many millions of species. I think we're going to find out, unfortunately. We seem dead, you know, set on finding out exactly how far we can push the biosphere before human society itself collapses. That seems to be the great, you know, race that we're on right now.
Yeah, one of the things that I remember when this exhibition opened, and even before, was the question, do you have any hope? And with all of the innovations, technological and otherwise, which are seemingly just in abundance, cascading from invention and thinking and adaptation, whether I have hope still, or do you have hope? Or Elizabeth, I'll ask you, do you have hope?
Well, I think it depends what you mean by hope for what. You know, it's obviously too late for, you know, the, you know, Christmas Island pipistrelle. It's too late for a lot of creatures. You know, do I have hope that, you know, my kids will lead? You know, I'm filled with fear. How's that? I'm very, very worried for my kids. And I'm very, very worried for, you know, a lot of, you know, creatures that have yet to even be named, to be honest. You know, they don't even have, they've never been scientifically described. So, I mean, I think we, you know, I once, it's, you know, these two poles, hope and hopeless, they definitely get a big workout these days. And I once heard a quote from a climate scientist, which I really admired, which is, you know, we really need to sort of, you know, put aside hope. Really, what we really need is courage. We do need, as Steve says, we need the courage to make really, really big changes. And, you know, that is, you know, our political system, you know, is so dysfunctional right now that making any changes, you know, I mean, I don't know, you know, every little thing turns into a, you know, excuse for posturing and paralysis. So when you bring together our political dysfunction with what needs to happen on such a massive level, both, you know, technologically and, as Steve was saying, sort of consciousness wise, it's hard to see a way. It is hard to see your way to that, to any of these things sort of, you know, coming right, working out. It's very difficult. Yeah, I think sort of being pessimistic these days, if you're not pessimistic, you sort of haven't been paying attention. How's that?
Well,
On a brief note, I really started reading your book and getting interested and involved and worried by reading Jared Diamond's Collapse, and how so many civilizations simply collapse into non-existence.
Well, they follow a pattern that repeats itself time and again. Every civilization that has ever existed in human history has followed that trajectory and repeated the steps of its predecessor without fail. So perhaps we'll be the first. But one of the things that I think is critical is that we're really lacking is an awareness of humanity's place in nature. We were raised and educated to think that humans are exceptional and not subject to the laws of nature. And that, I think, is a very, very dangerous mindset, because it inures you to the risks and dangers of proceeding on the current path, because we figure that we will use our exceptional brains and abilities and perseverance to figure a way out. And there are some ironclad laws in nature that will not permit that, including depleting resources. We have a finite resource base, which we are liquidating rapidly. It's as if we were not just spending the interest on our bank account, but we're spending down our bank account, and eventually it will be gone. And that's just a fact. There's just so much natural resource base for us to live on the interest of, hopefully, and not liquidate it in the process. But currently, that is our plan. So it's not a very good plan, I don't think. It doesn't bode well for the future if you can literally track how many years you have left of topsoil, or of fresh water, or of arable land, or of fuels, energy. These things are measurable, and they have a finite lifespan. And we're not paying attention to that because we think we can substitute new unknown sources for energy, for soil, for fertilizers, for all of the basic necessities of life that we're drawing down very, very rapidly, because we feel that we are not subject to the laws of nature, which gets back to what you were saying in your reading initially, Elizabeth, about our awareness of ourselves as part of the biosphere.
I think that's a good sort of summarizing point that you've brought up there, Steve. And believe it or not, we're 10 minutes from when we're wrapping things up. It's gone by very quickly, and we've definitely had some questions, and I wanted to bring up some while we have time for that. One question that's brought up is self-interest is motivation for our interest. So what can each of us do now that we're motivated? And certainly your conversation, I feel, has been motivating, both in prompting and also the facts that are presented. Let's start with you, Elizabeth, in terms of what do you feel can be making the greatest difference right now for people?
Well, I do think we all should be, and this is a huge issue, and we're all sort of, embedded in this, as Steve said, sort of economic system. And I don't want to claim there's a simple answer here, but we can start with certainly examining our consumption patterns and trying. I think people are somewhat overwhelmed by the flood of is this good or is that good? Is that recyclable? Is that not recyclable? The simplest answer, I think, is that we really need to be consuming a lot less, and we need to. So one thing is to just start thinking about all the choices that we make, and from there, and that that includes also transportation. How do we get places? Do we need to go to that place? The list goes on and on. And then the other answer is obviously political. We need big system-wide change, I don't know that there are any politicians, to be frank, who are really talking about the scale of change that's needed, but certainly there are elected officials who are making, better policy and worse policy. And we need to really, I don't know if these audiences, a Massachusetts-based audience or all over the country-based audience, but putting a lot of pressure on our elected officials to make the policy changes that will get the biggest changes accomplished in the shortest amount of time.
Right, that scale issue becomes so critical, doesn't it? And the political action. And I know, Steve, that's something you've referenced also in your work of the what do we do? And you've often said we need to do less, that it's sort of flipping things around in terms of we're always thinking of more, but one of the key things that we can be doing is looking at where we can be traveling less, where we can be.
Yeah, there are two things there that I'd really like to raise. I think that, just to get back to what Elizabeth is saying, and the questioner asked, what are our incentives? What are our motivations? And I think we need to imagine a different reward system, a different accounting of how we are scoring in our lives. Not measure it by our bank accounts per se, but maybe by our relationships, by our connection to our surroundings, to our community, things that are not included in GDP, but that are essential, that matter most in people's lives. If you ask somebody, what's the most important thing in their life, they're not going to say, well, I have, $10,000 in my bank account, or I just bought a new Tesla. They're going to say, I just spent time with my family and had this great experience. So I think we need to recalibrate how we measure our success in life, and re-examine the things that really matter to us. And the other thing I think is really important is that it's not just individuals who need to make individual decisions. That is the way our current economic system works today. It's that everything is an individual choice, an individual consumer choice. And if you do buy the right thing, or if you subscribe to the right app, it's going to, improve your life. But it's not going to be individuals, it's going to be communities. It's going to be a communal decision. We all have to do this together. We can't do it individually. It's not as if I am going to forgo buying one thing and Elizabeth is going to forgo buying something else. We all need to come together and make communal decisions about how we are going to go forward. Otherwise, nothing will work. And I think that our current system emphasizes the individual so much that it discounts the community. And I think we have to put the emphasis back on the community.
I think that's, excellent points there. And yes, not de-emphasizing the individual, emphasizing the collective.
Mm-hmm.
So then I think we have probably time for one more question, or a comment here that leads to a question. It will be necessary to collaborate and build new coalitions to address the climate and environmental emergency. What are the most important skills or qualities that we can draw upon to engage in collaborations across disciplines or cultures? This seems like a great summarizing question for you all. You want to start with Elizabeth?
Well, that's a really good question. I'm not sure that I'm qualified to answer any more than any of our listeners tonight. I mean, I think that organizing skills, which are skills, there are people who are very good at it, on the ground, community building and political organizing, which sort of Steve was sort of alluding to. I don't know exactly, if he would imagine a more sort of organic process, or, someone getting out there and knocking on doors and organizing people. But I think that the question, a really big question, a really interesting question, an important question is, how are different political constituencies that don't necessarily see it in their interest right now to be organizing around, the issues that the three of us have been talking about tonight. Will situations change? I mean, Ed was alluding to a community in Florida where, everyone was sitting in, very expensive houses. And as sea levels rise, people may find it in their interest to organize in different ways. And that, I think, if there is a hopeful note here, maybe that is it, that out of a certain amount of, simple pressure, the pressure of massive global change, that people will realize that they have to work together. Otherwise, all their houses will be underwater. So these are questions that I don't have a good answer to, but I certainly think they're really, really, really key questions.
Ed or Steve,
oh.
yeah, any thoughts from you on this?
I completely agree. I think that pulling together in communities, getting to know your neighbors, go meet them, go find out who they are, what skills they have, what you share in common. Building resilient communities is going to be the best path forward, I think, here, because we're going to depend on each other. We're going to depend on local sources for more of the things that we do and need in the future. We're going to need to build mutual aid societies where we will pool our resources. We're going to look after each other, take care of each other, help each other out in times of crisis. We're going to need to depend upon ourselves and our local communities for a lot of what's coming. And I think that we're going to find a lot of joy and pleasure in building those relationships as well. Just briefly, we had a snowstorm here a couple of weeks ago, and our entire neighborhood was lost power for several days, and trees were falling all across the road, and nobody could get in or out. So suddenly the community pulled together. We pooled our resources. We got to know each other. We checked on each other to see how everybody was doing, if anybody needed any help. Those of us who could walked into town to get supplies for other people whom we'd never met before. It was an incredible bonding experience, and probably the best thing that ever happened to this particular neighborhood. So there is really great opportunity for in crisis and in challenging times, and we can really build better relationships and craft better ways of going forward and measuring rewards and satisfactions by building resilient community. And I think that that's going to be one of the wonderful things about the years to come, in addition to the fact that we're just going to have to change. So it can be a positive thing.
Right. I think those are such great points to bring up, that resiliency aspect and the things that come from joining together, and not always with people that you necessarily had commonality with before, but then finding that commonality there. Yeah. One last question that I just want to address, because I think it's relevant to all of this, is someone saying, has Penn been assessing its carbon footprint and working to reduce it? And that has been very much part of the institution's climate and environment initiative. And just in December, the museum joined a company that is providing us all the electricity that we use at the institution from green energy sources. So that was a major commitment that the museum made to shift the source of our energy. And then we are doing assessments across the institution for other ways that we can be altering our practices and changing how we work as an institution. So I want to thank all of you for as our conversationalists tonight, taking this on and having such a candid conversation but for me, that I would say is not hopeless. It's revealing the challenge that we are in, and crisis as an opportunity. And so that to me, I feel is really important to take away from the conversation. And to all of you who joined us, thank you so much for being here. And the recording of this event will be available, but for a short period of time, for just a week. So we will be letting you know when that's posted. And I am very, very grateful to be in this conversation with all of you and looking at the cross-disciplinary opportunities. Thank you all for being here. And I look forward to when our paths cross again.
All right.
Take care, everyone.